Hi, this is Miss Klemme, and welcome to the podcast on macromolecules. What we have right here in yellow is a macromolecule, and essentially this is just a simple carbohydrate, and we eat them all the time, but what they're really made of is just simple repeating units of sugars, and we get them all together, we get complex carbohydrates, or one of the 4 macromolecules. Now this chain of carbohydrates is called a polymer, and that's because they're made of little smaller subunits called monomers. Let me write that up here. And in the picture below you can see in green the individual monomers, and through a series of reactions you can get a complex carbohydrate or a polymer down here, where there are all these little subunits, little monomers linked together. And depending on what type of monomer is being linked together, you get different macromolecules. You can have carbohydrates, you can have proteins, lipids, or nucleic acids, all depending on the different type of monomer that is linked together to make that polymer or that macromolecule. So the first macromolecule are the carbohydrates, and their function, which is why we eat them before big track meets or athletic events, is it's our body's short burst of energy. And it's also the primary source of energy where our body turns to first to look for energy. Its structure is made of individual units of sugars, and those sugars are called monosaccharides. And they're given that name because mono means one, and saccharide means sugar, so one sugar. When you get a bunch of sugars all lined up, like up here, you get a polysaccharide, many sugars, which is just a carbohydrate. And there's some basic examples, some sugar, pasta, glucose, which is the simplest sugar you can link together to make a polymer. The next one up are lipids. Their function is very similar to carbohydrates because they're also an energy source, but this is your body's long-term energy source. So your body turns to lipids for their secondary source of energy. Their structure, their monomers are made of long chains of fatty acids. And some examples below: butter, lard, oils. Now up here is an example of a lipid. And you can see those straight chains of fatty acids. Now the problem with lipids being so troublesome for us is because those chains are so straight, they can stack up really easy and form solids like butter. So essentially what you want to do when you eat lipids is you want to eat something with a chain that's a little bit more kinked. And if it's kinked, they can't stack up nicely and solidify in our bodies. They kind of have to always be in a little bit of a motion sense so that they remain liquid, like a vegetable oil, and it's more healthy to eat vegetable oils than it is to consume animal fats because of that stacking phenomenon. The third macromolecule is proteins, and protein function is primarily for building blocks, and it's the raw material that we're going to build our bodies with. And the structure is, they're composed of monomers called amino acids. So if you get a bunch of amino acids put together, you have a polymer, and that polymer, because it's made of amino acids, is called a protein. And some examples there: steak, mussels, enzymes, which are little biological catalysts. They speed up chemical reactions in our body. The final macromolecule are nucleic acids, and their function is simply to house or store genetic material. And their structure, their monomer is a nucleotide. And up here, if I can circle it, there's a nucleotide. It's made of 3 components. This little guy right here is a phosphate. Then you have a sugar, and in the yellow is something called a base. And there are different types of bases. You can put them in different orders to make different traits. So the two examples of nucleic acids are DNA and RNA. Those are the four major macromolecules. Make sure you know all of their functions, their individual monomers, and some examples from each. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and look at primary tissues of the body. And we're going to look at four different types of tissues: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. Now if you remember from an earlier podcast, is that tissues are just really groups of cells doing a similar task. So we'll look at the epithelial, and you should know in general what epithelial means. It's just the lining of organs of body cavities, connective tissue for support, muscle tissue can contract, and nervous tissue obviously can respond to our environment. Let's take a look at each one of those tissues in more detail. So first off, we have epithelial tissue. This is the lining tissue. And we can classify epithelial tissue based on the number of layers and based on the shape of the cell. So for example, there are a couple different layer categories. There's simple, which is just one layer thick. There's stratified, which is many layers thick. And then there's the one in between, the pseudo-stratified. Pseudo meaning false. So this one looks like it's stratified, but essentially it is just simple. It's one layer of cells. Then we can classify by shape. And we have the first one, cuboidal, which looks like cubes. It's a great cube there. The second one, columnar, which looks like bricks on end, or columns. And then on the bottom, we have the squamous epithelium, which just looks like really thin floor tiles. Now when you combine both layer and shape, you get some pretty unique tissues that are found in only certain areas of your body. So for example, this first one here, this simple cuboidal, that's specifically found in your kidneys, or glands that secrete hormones may have simple cuboidal epithelial lining. Simple columnar epithelial lining, this would be found in your small intestine, like the villi, the little fingers that help to absorb nutrients. The pseudostratified epithelium is found in your lungs, like your airways or trachea here. If you look really closely, you can see little tiny hairs coming off of here. And those hairs help to keep debris from getting deep into the lungs. The next epithelial tissue is stratified squamous, and this is many layers of floor tile type tissue, and this is found in places like your skin or your mouth, just where there's lots of wear and tear, so that there's many layers underneath there before you get to really the important stuff. And then the last one, simple squamous epithelium. This guy will be found in like your blood vessels and places where those tissues have to be so thin to allow for oxygen and nutrients and CO2 to diffuse through. So those are all the different types of epithelial tissue. And again, epithelial just means a lining tissue. Moving on to connective tissue, this is the most common of all the four types of tissues in your body. And before we talk about different examples, I do want to show you some terminology associated with connective tissue. So essentially, connective tissue has, these cells, their little nucleus, and they're embedded within a matrix. And that matrix, depending on what type of tissue, has different traits. The matrix is just like a little stuff, if you will, that those cells are sitting in. So if it happens to be like a cartilage, like in your ears and the tips of your nose, that matrix is like a gel type matrix, where the cartilage cells, which are called chondrocytes, sit in. If it's bone connective tissue, that gel, that matrix has ossified into something much harder. So that's just the terminology. The cells are embedded in some type of matrix. Here are the different types of connective tissue. The first one is areolar. It's a very basic connective tissue. It just helps to hold those organs in place. After that, we have dense fibrous connective tissue. The main two components of this type of connective tissue are tendons, which connect muscle to bone, and ligaments, which connect bone to bone. Below that is the bone connective tissue, and as I mentioned previously, this matrix has been ossified. It's been hardened to form much stronger support and protective system. The next one is cartilage. Cartilage you can see here in the gel matrix. You can see the chondrocytes in the purple dye. Below that is adipose tissue, lipids or fat used to insulate and as a secondary fuel source for our bodies. And then the last one is blood. Blood contains white blood cells, red blood cells, and those are always embedded in a liquid matrix known as plasma. The next type of tissue we have to discuss is muscle tissue, and there are 3 types of muscle tissue. We'll start with the one that you guys are most familiar with, skeletal muscle tissue. This is known as voluntary muscle because it's under our conscious control. You can see it's characterized by these striations in the muscle fibers. The next one is cardiac muscle. This is involuntary tissue, so we don't have to tell our hearts to beat every single moment that they beat. It just does it unconsciously. But it does share some features with skeletal muscle because it has striations. However, when we get to smooth muscle, we lose those striations, which is why it's called smooth muscle. It's much more milky in appearance. And smooth muscle, like cardiac, is involuntary. And smooth muscle is found in like your organs. It's found in your blood vessels to help them constrict or relax if they need to. And again, it's not under our conscious control, just like the cardiac muscle or the heart muscle. But no matter what type of muscle tissue you're talking about, they all do this. They all contract in some sort of response to either a nerve stimulus or some outside response that says you need to contract and provide some sort of movement. The last type of tissue is nervous tissue, and there are 2 types of cells. The one that you see over here in yellow with the tree-like branches as a neuron, and this is the primary nervous tissue cell that actually conveys messages from the brain out to your senses. The glial cells are a little bit harder to see in here, but you can see they're all around the neuron. And they just really help to, they're like the pit crew for the neuron. They help to support and nourish the neuron. They can help repair some damage to the neuron if necessary. So those are the glial cells. And that pretty much wraps it up for tissues. The one other thing I want to bring to your attention is that they do thankfully regenerate. Right here is a regeneration of, you can see, of epithelial tissue, but they also went in and did a repair of connective tissue by sewing together the Achilles tendon. So epithelial and connective tissue, they can be repaired. Bone tissue can be repaired too, but sometimes they can't be. Some tissues, like nervous tissue, is really tough to repair, and maybe in some cases it doesn't even repair at all. So keep that in mind as you're studying these different types of tissues in your body. Now I hope you found that helpful, and thanks for listening.